So Janet and I were talking one day a few months ago about whom to invite to come as a keynote speaker for this morning. We barely got into the conversation when the first person that came to mind for me was Jim Harnish, and I'm very excited that he's here. Jim and I first met back in 1974 when Gene and I were seniors at Stetson University, worshiping at Trinity United Methodist Church in DeLand, and Jim came there. Yeah, hey, all right, go Trinity DeLand. Jim came there as the associate pastor right out of his MDiv program at Asbury Seminary in Wilmore. We really got acquainted the next summer when, just by coincidence, long story you don't need to hear, I ended up stepping in to participate in a youth choir tour around Central Florida, and Jim was a part of that. We really spent a lot of time together, got better acquainted at that point. Jim is someone that I went to when I was struggling with my call to ministry. He was an early mentor of mine, and for that I will always be grateful. I'm also grateful for the fact that the role of mentor shifted over the years to the role of friend. And he has been a dear friend now for many, many years. We share together in a covenant group of clergy that we've been in together since 1982. I respect him, I look up to him, and I love him deeply. And it's a real privilege for me to welcome him as he comes to share with us this morning.
Good morning, sinners. We're all here. And it's a great joy to be with you, to be here in Oviedo, to be with Bob. What he said is he also makes fun of me and keeps me humble and gives me wisdom. And you are richly blessed to have him as your superintendent. And what can you say about Janet? I mean, this woman just is unbeatable, every detail. She's just amazing. And then I sat here remembering, we won't say how many years ago, that I sat in the living room and welcomed Alice into the church back in the early days at St. Luke's. And she was a confirmation sponsor for one of my daughters. How many? Well, my daughter's 40 now, so it's been a while. So across these years, to have watched her leadership, and now for her to be offering that leadership here in the district is really a beautiful thing. It's an amazing thing to be around over years and watch the way God continues to find and claim men and women who become leaders in the body of Christ. It's a rich gift, and so I'm grateful, humbled, and excited about being with you and with this whole team. What a smorgasbord of opportunities today. So I'm excited about being a part of this whole team that are providing this day for you. So thank you for the privilege of being here. Let's join together in prayer. Spirit of the living God, take our minds and think through them. Take our lips and speak through them. Take our hearts and set them on fire with your love. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, if you were there for Bob's installation as your superintendent, you'll have to agree it was a pretty weird way to start. I mean, there he was in the chancel of the church, sitting in an old rocking chair. Anybody remember it? Were you there? And this is not in the chancel, but that is the rocking chair. It's a family heirloom that's been passed down through the generation. It means a lot to them. They love this rocking chair. I'll bet you have one, something like it in your home as well. I know the one in our house where we rocked our babies and our grandbabies to sleep at night. We all love rocking. And Bob talked about that. He talked about how comfortable that rocking chair is, how good it feels. And just imagine yourself rocking away in your favorite rocking chair. He said it gives you the feeling that there's nothing else you really have to do, nowhere you have to go. It's so comfortable. He suggested that maybe we should replace those hard pews in some of our churches with rocking chairs. They're just can you feel it? There he was, your district superintendent, looking for all the world like a retiree waiting for lunch at Cracker Barrel, just rocking back and forth. And then Bob went from preaching to meddling. And he started talking about the churches in the East Central District that seemed to be a lot like rocking chair churches, where folks are just so comfortable and so easy and so accustomed to the way things have always been. He said they are churches where we are content to sit while the paint peels and the plaster cracks and eventually the property is sold. He said rocking chair churches eventually rock themselves into irrelevant complacency. Wow, what a metaphor. Am I going to ride that one? I promise I'll give him credit for it, but that is one good metaphor. In fact, it may be all too honest a metaphor for many of our congregations, rocking chair churches. I've been brooding over that, and as I brooded over it, I've remembered, you know what I love to do in a rocking chair? I love to go to sleep. Just like that. It's just a great place to go to sleep. And I remember rocking my grandchildren to sleep, humming Wesley hymns as an early form of childhood indoctrination. I remember times when I fell asleep before they did. It's just a wonderful place to go to sleep. And of course, there is, you'll remember, a biblical precedent for this. Do you remember Eutychus in the New Testament? Just in case you haven't run into Eutychus, he didn't write a gospel or anything like that. He's not real important. But here is Eutychus' story from the 20th chapter of Acts, beginning in the 9th verse. A young man named Eutychus was sitting in the window, and he was sinking into a deep sleep while Paul talked on and on. Can you imagine listening to Paul talk his way through the Epistle to the Romans? Lord have mercy. Eutychus was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul talked on. And when he was sound asleep, he fell from the third floor and died. Whoever said Luke didn't have a sense of humor? Paul went down, fell on him and embraced him, and then said, "Don't be alarmed, he's alive." Anybody remember that scene in Monty Python where they're picking up the dead bodies and the one guy is saying, "I'm not dead yet. I think I'm feeling better." It's like a lot of our churches. So Paul says, "Don't be alarmed, he's alive." Then, get this, Paul went back upstairs and ate, and he talked for a long time, right up until daybreak, and then he left. And everybody said, "Amen." That's not in the text. And they took the young man away alive, and they were greatly comforted. Now that's in the Bible, that story. And lest any of the preachers here get the idea that it is biblical support for long, slumber-inducing sermons, here I found this word from Jonathan Swift, preacher and novelist. Here's what Swift said about this text on sleeping in the church. he said, preachers now in the world, however they may exceed St. Paul in the art of setting people to sleep, do not extremely fall short of him in working miracles. In other words, preachers, don't put your congregation to sleep if you can't perform a miracle to wake them back up. Is what they say. Now, as I thought about Bob sleeping in his rocking chair and all of us sleeping in our rocking chair churches, my mind, of course, went to the American version of that story. It's been a long time since I had actually read Rip Van Winkle. It's a great story. You remember, he went to sleep in the Catskills, woke up 20 years later, and found himself in a totally new world. Everything had changed because he had slept through the American Revolution. Now, there's another parable for us as a church. How easy it is for us to sleep through the revolution that goes on in the world around us. And to wake up and suddenly discover this world isn't what we thought it was. And we don't quite know how to live within it. All of which brings me to a text for the day from the Revelation of St. John, the first chapter. I love John's introduction to us in the book. I, John, your brother who shares with you in the hardship, the kingdom, and the endurance. Isn't it good to have a brother or sister who shares with you in the hardship and the kingdom and the endurance that we have in Jesus? I was in a spirit-inspired trance on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice that sounded like a trumpet. Now, that's the Common English Bible says that it was a sleep-induced trance. Most of the other translations say he was in prayer. That's a good thing. I wonder if it might just be a sort of a spiritualized version of falling asleep in church. Maybe John just fell asleep in church one day, the way Eutychus did, the way it's so easy for, and suddenly he heard a voice that sounded like a trumpet. There are 108 references to trumpets in the Bible. Sometimes they call people to worship. Sometimes they announce danger. Sometimes they call people to battle. Sometimes they announce victory. The one common thing is they all call God's people to action. They wake us up and call us to respond to God's work in our lives. Sometimes we need that kind of a wake-up trumpet. Maybe you've heard, this is an old preacher story, maybe it's old enough that I can repeat it, about the guy who fell asleep in the back row in church every Sunday morning during the sermon. I really did have a guy like this when I was the associate of Trinity DeLand. He's gone on to heaven a long time ago, but he went to sleep during the sermon every Sunday morning. One day, well, he particularly did that when my senior pastor was preaching, but nonetheless, one day my senior pastor asked him, "Why are you going to sleep back there?" He said, "Preacher, I read the text, I hear your first paragraph. If I know I can trust you, I just let it go." Anyway, that's a true story, not a preacher story. Now back to the preacher story. This guy was always falling asleep in the back row in the church. Preacher decided he'd perform a trick on him one day, so very softly he said to the whole congregation, "All of us who want to be in heaven, raise your hand." Silently, the whole congregation raised their hand, except for the guy asleep in the back row. And then the preacher shouted, "And everybody who would rather be in hell, stand up!" The old guy's eyes popped open. He stood up. He looked around the room. He said, "Preacher, I'm not sure what it is we're voting on, but we're the only two in favor of it." Now, sometimes you just have to hear a trumpet that wakes you up in church. And I want to invite you to listen for that trumpet of the Spirit, that voice of God that comes like a trumpet call into our souls and says, remember who you are. That was Rip's problem, of course. Read the story. Rip Van Winkle woke up. His beautiful old gun that he had treasured for so long, his musket, was rusted, broken. His clothes were tattered, torn. He wandered back into his village. Buildings had changed. His house had crumbled. No one knew who he was. There was a strange flag hanging over the tavern. And the hardest thing was, Rip wasn't sure who he was. Nobody recognized him for a long time until one old woman looked closely in his face and said, you're Rip Van Winkle. You've been gone 20 years. Where have you been? Brothers and sisters, I'd submit to you that in the world in which we live, we're on the other side of revolutionary changes. Things that have created a whole new world into which we are called to live and to serve. And it is a culture in which the culture around us doesn't really recognize who we are. And we can so easily get confused. We need to be reminded of who we are, because we live in a culture where some of the things that we thought were sacred, the way Rip treasured his musket, some of them are now rusty and worm-eaten, like his old gun. Anybody used a Cokesbury hymnal lately? Some of the ways in which we've expected people to understand our churchy language have all faded away, so that folks don't understand the in-house talk and chatter that we use. A huge percentage of the people around us, particularly Gen Xers and millennials, have no inherent Christian memory. They don't know the stories that we assume people know. They can't sing along on the carols that many of us grew up with. We live in a whole new world where many of our old trusted church buildings are crumbling and being turned into upscale restaurants and taverns. Things around us have changed, and like Rip, we can easily forget who we are. Do you remember the way Mr. Wesley warned us about this? He wrote in his letter, I am not afraid that the people called Methodists should ever cease to exist, either in Europe or America, but I am afraid lest they should only exist as a dead sect, having the form of religion without the power. And this undoubtedly will be the case unless they hold fast to both the doctrine, spirit, and discipline with which they first set out. Brothers and sisters, I'd submit to you that as the people called Methodist, we need to hear the spirit of a trumpet that says, remember who you are. You are a movement of God's people who are centered in the love of God, the love that meets us wherever we are and loves us too much to leave us there. I said to the annual conference a couple years ago, we Methodists would rather love the hell out of people than scare the hell out of them. We are people centered in the love of God. We are a faith community that dares to affirm that we have open hearts and open minds and open doors. We are a fellowship of disciples in which questions are welcomed and doubts are affirmed, and people can search for the honest experience of God's grace in their own lives. We are a church energized by love and not driven by the pervasive fear that is driving so much of our culture these days. We are people who are politically engaged without being politically co-opted by any political party. God is not a Republican or a Democrat, and Jesus will not be voting in the primary in New Hampshire this week, contrary to some politicians' suggestions. Most of all, we are people who live in grace, who offer to the world this amazing grace that we have discovered in Jesus Christ, passed down to us the way Wesleyans have shared and understood it across the years. Several years ago, I was sitting in the first session of our new member class over at Hyde Park, where we always started by going around the circle, and everybody would share how they found their way to Hyde Park the first time, and then what caused them to stay there. The second question is really important. But the first question, how did you find your way to Hyde Park? What's your first time here? There was a young woman. Now, it's always dangerous to say that about anybody, particularly women. I'm guessing she was somewhere 30s to early 40s. Just a guess. Anyway, this young woman on this side of the room, when it came to her, tears started to roll down her cheeks. She said, "The first Sunday I was here, you preached about grace." She said, "You used some weird word to describe it." I said, "Might that have been prevenient?" She said, "Yeah, that was the word." That was the word. And she said, "The way you talked about grace was what I always wanted to believe, but I didn't know there was a church that believed it." Worked our way around the rest of the room, got over to this side of the room. There was another woman, guessing here, maybe late 40s, 50s, something, another young woman on this side of the room. And when it got to her, she paused. She choked back a tear. She said, I'm really amazed. She said, my first Sunday here was the same Sunday that woman's talking about. And she said, when I heard you talk about grace, it was what I had always been waiting to hear. Brothers and sisters, remember who we are and the great gift that we have to give to people who are hungry and searching for it. And then listen for the voice that comes like a trumpet that says, reclaim your calling. In the words that Bob is using throughout the district, remember the mission. We so easily get confused between mission and methods. We get all hung up on the color of carpet in the parlor and act as if that has something to do with our mission. We get all distracted by a multitude of good things that may or may not directly enable us to fulfill our mission. I was a delegate to the General Conference in Denver when the General Conference voted to say that the mission of the church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. The cynical part of me thought, well, that must be a great relief to Jesus that we finally got around to voting on what he had always told us we were supposed to be doing anyway. But I believe in sanctification. I'm getting over my cynicism because lo and behold, that language of that mission, by my observation, is beginning to take hold among people in United Methodist congregations. And I get out and around just enough to be able to say that all across this country, in a multitude of different places, of congregations of different sizes, with different perspectives and different convictions, all across this nation, are congregations that are coming alive because they are remembering the mission. And they are pouring their energies into doing whatever they can to be a part of forming disciples in the likeness of Christ. Remember your mission. Just in October, I was in Atlanta waiting to get on the flight to go back to South Africa again. I've made that trip several times. It's 18 hours in the air, overnight. Folks come to that flight comfortable. You know, everything short of pajamas, but a lot of sweatshirts and jeans, comfortable. We're waiting to board, and unmistakably, there's a group of 5 or 6 young Mormon missionaries. You knew they were Mormons because they had their black pants and their black coat and their white shirt and their black narrow tie. You know, unmistakable. And lo and behold, the next morning, when we got off the plane in Joburg, they were still in their black pants and black coat and white shirt and black tie. They hadn't even loosened the tie during the night. Well, during the night, I got up to stretch, and there where people were standing around in the exit was one of these young Mormon missionaries, and another guy standing there. The guy said, well, why are you going to South Africa? He said, I'm going for the church. And the guy said, well, what are you going to do there? And he said, proselytize. Just about that firmly. Proselytize. The other guy walked off. I think that was all he wanted to hear. So I turned to this young guy and said, you ever been to South Africa before? No. I said, you ever been to Joburg before? He said, no. I said, it's quite a city. I said, do you have any idea what part of Joburg you might be going to? He said, no, I guess they'll just send us around. I said, okay. I didn't want to tell him Joburg is no place to be just sent around. Believe me. I said, wow. I said, so you've never been to Africa before? No. I've never been out of California before. I said, oh, really? He said, I've never even been to Mexico. I said, I remembered the Book of Mormon, and if you've seen the play, I said, well, you're going to have quite an experience. It was like that. Now, set aside the fact that he was totally unprepared for what he was going to find. Set aside the black suits and white shirts and black ties and all. Set aside the theology that we're talking about. But I came away from that conversation wondering, how many United Methodists are as passionate about making disciples in a way that is consistent with our tradition and our theology as that young man was about what he had to offer to the world? Brothers and sisters, we have a calling. We have a mission. Reclaim your calling, remember your mission, and don't get drawn off into a multitude of good things that don't enable you to fulfill that calling through the life of your congregation. I love the way John Wesley sent George Shadford to America. Here are the words that Wesley gave to Shadford when he came across from England. I think they're going to appear. Do we have Shadford? Maybe I cut him out. Anyway, what John Wesley said to George Shadford was, I let you loose, George. There he is. I let you loose, George, on the great continent of America. Publish your message in the open face of the sun and do all the good you can. Remember your mission. And then finally, listen for the Spirit that comes with the voice of a trumpet and says, wake up, renew your vision. Old Rip, when he woke up, the story says he had a hard time looking around, trying to get clarity about who he was and where he was, what he was seeing. Any of us who are tempted to rock away to sleep in our churches need to hear the Spirit calling us to wake up, get a fresh vision of who you are, of what your community is, and how you can fulfill that commission, that calling in your community. Our granddaughter, Julia, was 3 or 4. She was staying with us, and at some unbelievably awful hour during the night, she crawled into bed with us and seemed to be more awake than I really wanted her to be. And so I said, now, Julia, we can't get up until we see the sunshine in the window. And then I rolled my head over, closed my eyes, assuming that she would follow my example and go back to sleep. A few minutes went by, a tap on my shoulder. I opened my eyes. Julia said, Grandpa, you can't see the sunshine if your eyes are closed. And you know, the awful temptation in our rocking chair congregations is that we become so comfortable with the way things are that we don't really have our eyes open to see what God can do in and through us. We can become so darkened and depressed by how weak we are, how small we are, all the things we've lost, that we don't have our eyes open to the way God might use what we do have to reach out to the world around us, to invite somebody else to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. There's another word about a trumpet in Revelation. It's over in the 3rd chapter, in the word from the Spirit of Christ to the angel of Sardis. The Spirit says, I know your works. You have a reputation for being alive, but you are in fact dead. Wake up and strengthen whatever you have left, teetering on the brink of death. For I have found that your works are far from complete in the eyes of my God. So remember what you have received and heard. Hold on to it. Change your hearts and lives. If you can hear, listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. That might be the word of the Spirit for some of our congregations here today. Congregations that start to feel like we don't have anything left. We're not what we used to be. We'd like to be what we were in the glory days. If only next year were 1950, then we'd be in good shape. But if next year might be 2016 or 17, we got work to do. How many of us, like the church in Sardis, have started to feel, well, we just don't have much left? And how many of us need to hear, thank you so much, how many of us need to hear the Spirit? God isn't finished with you yet. Your work in this world is not complete. Listen for the Spirit that says, strengthen what you do have. Take what you do have and allow God to use it to fulfill God's mission and purpose in this world. Listen for the voice of the Spirit. When Bob and I talked about this day, he used the phrase corporate inertia. The phrase caught my imagination. I did what everybody does. Well, I Googled it. I found out that in corporate America, there are all these conversations about what they're calling corporate inertia. Here are the main elements of corporate inertia. So I'll just whip them off quickly to you. Distorted perception, myopia, hubris, denial. Sound like any church you know? Dulled motivation, a lack of awareness of the need for change? How often do we just not really think there's a need to do anything different than we were doing in 1960? You know, failed creative response, frozen by the speed and complexity of change, a lack of strategic vision, political deadlocks, tying up time and energy in wrangling and internal politics and vested interests. Now this guy, this is UCLA business professor talking about corporate America. Sounds a lot like General Conference to me. Action disconnects. Leadership in action, embedded routines, dysfunctional culture. That's what the business world calls corporate inertia. In the church, that's what I'd call falling to sleep in a rocking chair congregation. And this guy from UCLA says that the only antidote to that is a process of transformation. He defines it as a fundamental change leading to dramatic improvement in performance. It always includes structural change and dramatic alteration in behavior of individuals. The only antidote to congregational inertia is that kind of transformation. And we have biblical language for it. Words like repentance, leaving the past behind and turning in a new direction, conversion, the radical reorientation of the heart of our life and our congregation, revival, allowing the Spirit of God to do something new among us that we never expected, transformation, Paul calls it the renewal of our minds in the likeness of Jesus Christ. We have the gift of the Spirit that can break through our congregational inertia. We stand in the line that goes all the way back to John on Patmos, listening, waiting for a Spirit that sounds like the sound of a trumpet. The way it came to Isaiah saying, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you." Does anybody believe that for your church? If so, I remember words. Some of us will remember Bishop Ken Goodson. He was a lion of a preacher, and I still remember him at the old pastor's school at Leesburg one year saying, "I have not come to play taps over the death of the church. I've come to play reveille for the church to wake up and fulfill its calling." May God enable us to hear that trumpet again. And